Welcome to Season 2 of the Wellbeing in Sport podcast. We're here for Episode 1, where myself and Russell Discombe are joined by Dr Shakiba Moghadam to speak about mental health in sport. We hope you enjoy. So we're back, the Wellbeing in Sport podcast, Season 2, and a few subtle changes. We've got video podcasting now available to support us. So thankfully we were not taken off air, and actually we've been given more freedom now. So the use of short form content will hopefully be supporting us soon. And I guess the key change, Russell, is that myself and you are hosting, and a few people might be worried about that. Thankfully, Kevin is joining us for Season 2. He is unfortunately away at the moment on some annual leave, but we are in safe hands, hopefully, as a duo to host this episode. How are you feeling, Russ?
Yeah, nervous. No, we need Kev back, so hopefully he'll be back. He'll be back soon. But yeah, I don't know why we need video. I don't know if people want to watch us. Yeah, but
we'll soon find out. Apparently, there's a need for short form content now in podcasting, so we'll try and modernise and keep up with the times. But thankfully, we've got the guests to keep our podcast going as well. They were what made it so successful in its first season, and I'm sure will elevate us to more success in Season 2. So no pressure, but it's great to have Dr Shakiba Moghadam with us today. How are you, Shakiba?
I'm really good, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's my first time down here, so this is all very exciting.
And video podcast, new for you?
Very new, yeah, so I'm going to have to watch my facial expressions.
Okay, yeah, no judgment when me and Russell
we'll be able to tell.
Yeah, are on the mics. So in line with tradition with the podcast, and hopefully in line with what Kevin does so well, we're going to try and navigate a really important topic, a really prevalent topic within sport at the moment, which is mental health, and even more so towards those within contact sport. So Shakiba's a fantastic researcher in the area with expertise in both applied and research background within mental health and sport. So it'll be great to pick into some of those insights for today's episode. But to start off with, before we get into that, we do have a tradition that has become somewhat of a fan favourite, and by fan I mean mine. But we have a question from our last guest, so I had to dig back through the archives. I think the last episode was filmed in April, so I had to dig back into the recordings and listen to ourselves, Russell, which I know you're not fond of. But we do have a question from our last guest, which was Caitlin, who did a terrific episode on ACL injury and the psychology of injury. But she left the following question for you, Shakiba, and it's a good one. So if you were to meet your 5-year-old self, what would your 5-year-old self be most proud of about the person that they have grown up to be? Over to you.
Yeah. So I devised this from like really philosophical answer to not so much. So I'm going to just kind of reflect on those. So as a 5-year-old, I have a twin sister, and we grew up in Iran, in Tehran, in the capital. And back in those days, girls playing football wasn't so socially accepted. So I think my 5-year-old self would still be really proud that I'm still really keen on football, that I have a whole collection of different football jerseys. I think that would be a mega thing for me if I was to kind of reflect back. I think the fact that I'm still kind of keeping up the good fight for girls and women's existence in football, and just I think in the world in general, particularly in male-dominated areas, I think my 5-year-old self would be very proud of that, given that kind of fight started very early on. For me, I would say, I think my 5-year-old self would be proud that my favourite dish is still my mum's Iranian festanjun, which is an Iranian pomegranate walnut dish, which is really delicious. Again, that I would be proud I have 2 beautiful huskies. As a 5-year-old, I was obsessed with animals. So I think, I'd be proud that I am the mother of 2 huskies. And finally, I'd be proud that I've stopped eating mud. So as a 5-year-old, me and my twin sister, we had a beautiful garden, and we used to make like little mud kebabs and then eat it, which is obviously not good.
Yeah.
So very, very proud that I've stopped eating mud as well.
Very nice. Not appetizing though?
No, not anymore. I don't know. It depends. When you get the smell of that after the rain. I get like glimpses of, should I bite?
Should I just tempt myself into a mud kebab?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
And then I remember I'm a grown adult and that's not a good idea.
Yeah, very nice. Following the mud kebab, we'll try and go into something, I guess, a little bit more serious, which is hopefully fair to say is kind of your research expertise, and certainly with your PhD in the area. It was great to have someone with your knowledge and your understanding of mental health in sport from both a research and applied context, if you like, on the podcast today. I think briefly, just to kind of set the scene, it would be good for you to maybe talk a little bit about what you would judge or assess, I guess, mental health in sport to look like, whether that's the current prevalence or how it's developed, essentially any angle that you would like to take. But what is your kind of introduction to mental health in sport broadly? Yeah,
I think the first thing I'd want to say in regards to that is mental health, the discussion of mental health in sport kind of came about in and around 2015, 2016. That's not to say that other researchers weren't kind of looking at it, but the main bulk of research came around that time. So that's about 10 years ago, which is really recent. And yet mental health has existed forever within sport. And I think one of the things that maybe gets a bit lost in media and in conversations in sport is that actually athletes are not immune to experiencing mental health symptoms and disorders, and that they are human first, then they're an athlete, and then they're a human after. And of course, they're a human during their athletic career and identity as well. So despite the fact that the research has been somewhat recent, the existence of mental health, the experience of mental health symptoms and disorder has been there forever. I think the shift of research has looked at generally like the difference between elite athletes and their mental health and their experiences of mental health in comparison to the general population. That's kind of where a lot of those systematic reviews, meta-analysis was sitting. And then eventually it moved on to treatment. So how do we actually go about treating? And now it's starting to look at, so Dr. Paul Grzinski's work, so they're based in Greenwich, looks at the more kind of explicit areas of demographic differences such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other characteristics and identities that makes up a person. And how does that kind of merging with the athletic identity, and then what does mental health look like from those point of views? So we've kind of seen this more generic overview of mental health, then moved into the very explicit areas. And now I think very much we're looking at the concept of mental health literacy, which I'm sure I'll speak a little bit more about as we go on.
So what actually inspired you to research in this area? Why did you sort of pursue this specific area?
Yeah, for me, so I was an athlete for some time. I competed in amateur boxing at the elite level. So I kind of built my way from a novice to the developmental phase to then the elite phase. So as a kind of amateur boxer, there was loads of different challenges that I experienced, from the demands of being a student athlete at the time to the very kind of sport-specific challenges of being in boxing, or particularly as a woman. It's weight regulated, so that brought on its own kind of challenges. It's a combat sport. The social expectations of being a woman and being in boxing, and the accumulation of all those different demands and pressures, and then you're chucked in the ring. You know, I think one of my last fights was in York Hall, under the lights. We had these big figures in boxing watching us, and there's a lot of pressure to perform, but to also perform to win. And I think there's a difference between performing and then performing to win. And with boxing, it could be down to half a point. And so I think experiencing all those different things, and then just my general interest in sports psychology, brought those two and kind of married them up quite well, which led to a lot of my earlier research being on women boxers, some of the challenges women boxers experience, and then the opportunity for the PhD came up looking at mental health literacy, and yeah, I grabbed it with both hands and didn't let go.
That's really cool. So when did you actually finish boxing or fighting?
So my last fight was in 2016, so it was just before I started my PhD, and I had to really stop because I was quite severely concussed. And so it was more so through injury that I stopped. And then I got back into it in 2019, just got back into sparring, so I'm not competing anymore. I'm still kind of training in boxing, sparring, helping some of my friends out with their upcoming fights. Still got a keen interest, but I've definitely taken a step back from competing now.
And where did that interest in sports psychology come from when you were boxing? Did you study that at university? Did you just pick up on it? Did you just read about it? Where did you develop that interest?
Yeah, it was my second year of uni, and so I did an undergraduate in psychology, and the second year of uni, we got to pick different modules, and I picked sports psychology. It was because I was just starting boxing back then. Not so competitively, but I was boxing, and I thought, well, I've seen others experience X, Y, and Z, and I've experienced these, and hey, there's this topic called sports psychology, and I hadn't really come across it before. I was actually really keen on forensic psychology to begin with, and then we had this kind of like criminal investigator from Channel 4 who did a guest speaker talk, and he really put me off because he spoke about this like convicted criminal who would basically just prey on women and like lock him up in his attic, and Remo just got on my bicycle, and I like went back home to I was in a shared home with 4 other really great friends, and I didn't even say hello to them. I came in, just went upstairs and just decompressed, and I was like, no, I'm not doing this. And then found sports psychology, spoke to Dr Neil Weston, who's an amazing sports psychologist, does incredible research. And I said, I think I'm quite interested in this. Do you think I should pursue it? And he was like, yeah, do it if you enjoy it. And then, so I took the module in my third year, really enjoyed it, wanted to explore it more, like the more applied side of it, but also the more exercise psychology part I was really interested in too. And the government was doing this like one-off scholarship, and I applied for it, I got it, and I was really happy. So then it enabled me to pursue the Masters in sports psychology, and I just completely fell in love with the area. Which then led on to taking a year to work as a researcher and just do some lecturing here and there. And then the PhD came up, interviewed for her and got that. And the rest is history.
And the PhD then, that probably brings us on quite nicely. And I know you mentioned really earlier about what it was revolved around, but give us a little bit about what you did in your PhD then and what's kind of come out of it and how that's led on to today.
I could talk about this forever. I did my Viva for hours. So my PhD looked at the concept of mental health literacy in rugby players who identify as women. So the bulk of it was around mental health literacy, and our mental health literacy is really about our own understanding of mental health. How do we define it? What does it mean to us? And then how do we recognize symptoms of mental health disorders in ourselves, but also in others too? And then what are our attitudes towards seeking support? How do we prevent it? How do we adhere to it? Who do we go to? Do we even know who to go to? And where does that knowledge actually come from? How have we gained that knowledge? So it does a good job of kind of also, underlying epistemology and ontology of mental health, looking at our own lived realities, and also where do we gain the knowledge about mental health and what does that mean? And overall, how does that shape our behaviours towards particularly seeking support and help seeking? And then when you look at that in a sport that is historically and traditionally very male dominated, it's a contact sport, and you have groups of people who are training in it, competing in it, what are their perspectives of it as well, given it has quite high injury rates, physical injury rates, but also head injuries are very prevalent in rugby. So the accumulation of all those different demands and pressures hand in hand with people's own knowledge of mental health made for a really interesting research project, PhD. And so the first part of it, so I did a systematic review on just the prevalence of mental health symptoms and disorders in rugby players in general, just to look at the research. What was the research saying? Was there much research? And I kind of just dived into it thinking, this is a traditional sport. There's going to be so much stuff on there. And there was like 8 studies. That was it. 8 studies. And one of those 8 studies had a cohort of approx, I would say, like 152 men and 14 women. So it was 14 women out of this pool of so many different rugby players. And it was just 14 women's kind of perspectives that was taken in this quantitative study. So it also really helped me kind of narrow down where are the gaps in literature, where are the attention really needed. And it was really needed on women rugby players. There was a complete, we speak about lack of research. This was like almost non-existent, as if women just did not exist in rugby. And what I kind of found out from that initial process was to completely remove my own expectations from research and what I would assume to find, but also that a lot of the interventions that were small in numbers, but what they were kind of being used for men and women rugby players were created and catered to men, but given to women rugby players too, without actually acknowledging their needs and their voices. And it spoke to the bigger problems of like medical treatment and mental health treatment, how it's been created for men, but without the acknowledgement and completely with the absence of women. So it was really interesting to kind of find that out, because when we look at the mental health kind of spectrum more widely, men are still not seeking support for their mental health at all. They don't speak about it. So where has the research gone wrong? Where are the gaps that hasn't been addressed yet? Because yes, okay, a lot of research is done with men, but are we asking the right questions? Because men are experiencing quite severe symptoms of mental health disorders. They have very high suicide rates, and yet they are the least likely population to seek support. So, okay, we've got abundance of research with men, but then what are we doing wrong as researchers? And it comes back to the fact that we're not asking the right questions in regards to mental health from men or women, really.
I've got quite a few follow-up questions. Yeah.
Go on, Russ.
So first off, you're looking at investigating sort of mental health literacy within women's rugby. Do you think that kind of translates across other women's sports as well? Do you think the key take-home messages, like the lack of female engagement in research and the questions, or the research designed for that population, do you think that kind of translates across other different domains?
I think it transfers over to other male-dominated sports that women competing.
Okay.
And I think that comes naturally because, we have this saying in research, hard to reach populations. And I'm completely against that saying, because I feel like it's almost like a cop-out of, that's too much effort, I'm not going to do it. Whereas I think there's always ways of doing research. You just may have to be a bit more creative. You may have to jump a few more hoops, wait for that ethical approval to go internally and externally, which, adds on a bit more waiting time, but it's absolutely doable. So I feel like there is research with female athletes, but I think when we look at it with a closer lens, there isn't enough research where women compete in male-dominated sports, and also vice versa. There is not enough research on male athletes who compete in more what's referred to as like female-dominated sports. But I feel like what I did in my research, I completely removed this binary, female and male sport, and just looked at the lived experiences of the athletes and kind of let them tell me if it's male-dominated or if it's not, and if so, how does that impact them? So I think if I was to do another PhD, who knows, I would like to do it also from the perceptions of men who compete in female-dominated sports and kind of see their experiences, because I think that would add a lot of value to research too.
I think it's an interesting one, and like Russell said, both of us sat there then when you were speaking about your PhD and had numerous questions. The one that jumped out to me straight away was this idea around what we've either not done adequately as researchers in this area, or the translation of that into output. Essentially, everyone in this room and everyone listening to this podcast wants to see a reduction in the amount of cases within sport that is associated with mental health or suicide rates, etc., etc. My question off the back of that is, what do you think feasibly is able to be done here? I.e., is it unrealistic to try and reduce the likelihood of mental health prevalence within sport? Because actually we're trying to encourage more people to seek help, and therefore your initial statistic might be an increase in mental health cases. Is that a good sign or is that a bad sign?
I'm going to give you a really annoying answer and say it's neither, because I feel like to address one, we need to address and go back and address other things. By that, a lot of this, I think, goes back to the availability of support existing in the first place. I don't think we can stop people experiencing mental health symptoms. So no, I don't think that can stop. But I think what we could do feasibly is to provide, to actually have concrete support and not just have it for the elite athletes. We need to normalise it from the grassroots, from the novice to the developmental phases to also elite. So it becomes far more normalised that if you're feeling a certain way and you feel like it's impacting you, it's normalised to go and seek mental health support. Just like how you may play football and you get tackled and you get an ACL injury, you're not going to just be like, oh, okay, I'll just plaster up myself and forget about it and keep playing. Like, it's going to hurt. It's going to get worse. So it's changing attitudes towards our mental health and having the same attitudes towards, I feel like there's something that's really eating me up inside. I want to go and seek a bit of support and not waiting until we are in that crisis, that kind of red zone, doing it when we're experiencing the symptoms. Just like as you would if your knee's hurting, you want to go and get it addressed. You want to prevent anything getting from worse. You won't go and seek support until your bone's literally sticking out and you think, okay, this is the time I should go and get support now.
Yeah.
So it's changing attitudes, and it's changing expectations of professionals expecting people to come to them, but rather we go to them. And I think changing that expectations is going to take some time. We're going to need to have more resources, more funding. Governing bodies really need to step up. I think that's where I was going with the point, is governing bodies need to step up, because this isn't going to stop. And with technology heightening, with AI and the crazy things AI can do now, imitating athletes and creating scenarios that are not real, eventually that could also lead to some real negative situations. So it's predicting what the future may look like and addressing it and preventing issues now, rather than having a reactive approach.
And if you could give the governing body sort of unlimited budget to spend on this area, what sort of things would you suggest that they implement?
I think my immediate recommendation would be having a crisis team within every sports setting. We have community crisis teams, although I know there isn't enough at all. But it's to have a crisis support team as like the first. That's the first thing I would do if I had an abundance of funding, is to go in every sports setting. And then alongside that, so that would address for me if anyone's in crisis, i.e. experiencing suicide ideations and or have attempted suicide, there is now a support system in sport places. And then it would be through education, so having different types of mental health literacy interventions for the athletes, for the coaches, for sport officials, and also for families who might have youth athletes, partners and someone who may be athletes. I think we have to work collectively with the community or with the sport community to help the bigger conversation of mental health. And I feel like at the moment we're very much in that just speaking about it and not much doing. So I think we need to move to the doing part eventually, because mental health disorders, symptoms, it doesn't discriminate. It can come at any point. It's timeless. So I think keep talking, but more doing as well alongside of it.
Because I read one of your papers, which was an intervention study. Is that right?
Yes.
Or the follow-up was the intervention study. And you mentioned sort of more interventions throughout sport. What would a perfectly designed intervention look like? I know that might be throwing you on putting the spotlight on you a little bit, or talk us through the intervention that you did in your research.
Yeah, I think for me, so that intervention was a feasibility study. So it was my last kind of study I did, and it really brought everything together. And I kind of took on the medical research framework, which the last phase of it is, okay, well, you've got your data collection, you've collected statistics from your participants to understand prevalence rates and so on, attitudes towards help seeking, looking at concepts of like wellbeing. So that was my second study. And then I interviewed people to better understand their behaviours, i.e. what my second study showed, and I'm going to come back into how this relates to the intervention and answer that question. My second study looked at wellbeing, help-seeking behaviours, mental health literacy in the women rugby players, had about roughly 208 women who competed there who were semi-elite. So they were kind of through that developmental phase, looking to maybe hopefully play for England someday. And what they showed was really they had one of the highest mental health literacy scores. They were like up there with trainee doctors and so on in terms of really excellent knowledge about recognition of symptoms, where to go to gain help. But then when you compared that to their help-seeking behaviours, they scored so low. So they know where to go and who to go to, and yet they wouldn't engage in those behaviours. Their wellbeing scores was really low, particularly among the bisexual women rugby players as well. So it was really interesting to kind of look at the demographic differences, but also the fact that they had such low wellbeing scores. So then the qualitative part followed that up by one-to-one interviews with some semi-elite women rugby players to better understand what was going on really behind this statistics and the numbers. And what kind of came out of that was that there's a lack of support services, available support services, accessible support services that they can go to. So they know where to go to, but there's nothing there for them to go to, so they can't engage in it. They spoke about the kind of stigma that is still surrounding mental health, help seeking, and because they have to kind of prove their place within a male-dominated sport, they kind of spoke about the fact that, well, I'm not going to add anything else for anyone to give me an excuse that, well, you don't belong here. So that added pressure, I think, really spoke volumes to how the cultural sport also needs to change as we shift attitudes towards mental health. And the fact that there needs to be an increase of mental health literacy within the sport completely, from officials, coaches, players, and so on. And there has to be an equitable approach to providing mental health support to everyone in the sport. So then I took all of that, kind of listened to what they had to say, and created a tailored intervention, which was online, so it was far more easily accessible. So it was COVID period, so I had to kind of make it online, even if I wanted to take it to them in person, which I think would have added a kind of a more personalised touch, but wasn't able to. And the intervention kind of looked at different things. From the first part of it was kind of getting them familiar with mental health literacy. The second part was kind of looking at stigma, attitudes. The third and fourth part was kind of then giving the reins to them in terms of, here are some scenarios of, this is like an anecdote. What would you do in this situation? How would you take what you've learned so far? So it was only eight weeks, and then kind of did a 2-week follow-up with them. So 4-week follow-up. But just through that 8-week intervention, meeting them once a week and kind of giving them some activities, answering some questions, the feasibility study found that there was an increase in mental health literacy, but also at the same time, simultaneously, there was a decrease in public stigma and self-stigma towards psychological help seeking. So it proved effective, but again, I don't want to I don't want to big it up too much, because it was a feasibility study. There were small numbers of people who took part. But what it suggested is that actually this does help when we personalise and tailor interventions and bring in the education side of it, but we contextualise it to the real life scenarios that the athletes would experience. It works. It has potential. So really we should be rolling it out in different situations, in different contexts, on bigger platforms for, again, officials, for coaches. What also came from that was that a lot of the athletes would kind of go to their coaches to seek support. But if your coach doesn't have the mental health literacy and or gives you the kind of not so useful advice like, just man up and get on with it, it could really demoralise someone even more. And that's why I think we need to have a multidisciplinary perspective of rolling the intervention out for everyone in sport rather than just athletes themselves.
Yeah, so some really promising sort of early findings about the need for interventions. What was it like studying mental health during COVID?
So strange, honestly. It was one of the most strangest things, because I think the conversations usually started, do you have COVID? I was like, no, not yet. It was really strange because people were going through, a lot of people were experiencing loneliness, and like rugby was a space for them where they were socializing. They could really relate to other people, and so that a lot of people had lost that community. And yeah, it really came to life that at that period during COVID, this was kind of the heightened period of COVID as well, and lockdown. I think certainly that added on to why we need these interventions and why we also need to make it accessible, because we live in an ever-changing globe, so who knows what can happen next.
And I think, again, there's so many questions that I could sit down and ask you about this, and time is obviously a big thing within this podcast. But for me, one of the big things that jumped out there from certainly my research background as well is the use of others, and the role of others in supporting an athlete, whether that is generally with technical improvement, whether that is sustaining psychological enhancement in other areas. But for you, from a mental health perspective, you mentioned the coach there. I think you alluded to earlier education with the parent if it's a youth athlete as well. How does that look like, and how important are the role of others when it comes to both help-seeking behaviours and actually managing mental health symptoms and disorders as well?
I think it's paramount, because for an athlete, they have these different kind of social interactions with their coach, their teammates, other teams as well. And then you have like the non-athletic domain where it's their family, if they're at school, university. And so I think their relationship with others, the social setting, is really, really important, because it can impact the way they adhere to seeking support. And so if, for example, there is someone who, I says the wrong thing, but isn't encouraging of them seeking professional support, that could then in turn really impact the way they seek support and who they seek support from. That part of it, the relationships, is really, really important. So I think the one thing about kind of rolling out a mental health literacy intervention for everyone addresses that point, that if your athlete goes to their significant other, if they go to a parent, if they go to a caregiver, to a teacher even, people are informed, and that instead of saying something that could be discouraging, they are encouraging them, they are signposting them to the right places. So I think it's paramount that not only the athlete, but the other people that surround the athlete are also informed. And I say informed really mindfully. I'm not talking about, you can diagnose on the spot. Of course not. I'm more so speaking about like just having an awareness of, okay, this person has skipped a meal twice in an evening, 3 times in the evening. Should I explore that? Should I speak to them? What kind of questions should I ask that's not intrusive, that gives them autonomy to speak? Those are the really important conversations around a dinner table when they're just having a catch up with someone. Am I asking the right questions that may enable someone to feel comfortable to then open up that actually I'm not okay? I feel this way or that way. I'm not really sure what to do.
And I think you mentioned there athlete autonomy is quite a big one. Similar to yourself, my background is more football, and I'm thinking about recently, again, probably in the last 3 or 4 years, there seems to be, and maybe this is my football kind of fan head on, but there seems to be certainly more exposure to it. If I think about Burnley Football Club did a documentary for Amazon Prime, and they focused on I think it was Lyle Foster and his kind of mental health symptoms and disorder at the time. Harry Maguire has come out and spoke about conversations with the England psychologist and how they were just informal kind of coffee at breakfast conversations, but it again was autonomous for him.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, and I'm relating this in a sense of contact sport now, but do you feel like sport is moving in the right direction, or are we just seeing more of a spotlight on it now rather than maybe what was being done 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, I think it's moving, but I feel like it's moving very slowly. Given like the depth of research that we do have access to now and the technology, I feel like we should be further ahead. Particularly when you look at advancements in other areas like physical injury advancements, looking at how do we recognise physical injuries and so on, and treatment of those physical injuries. It's really advanced when you compare it to 10 years ago, and yet we don't see that same pattern for mental health treatments. We're kind of still having very similar conversations about mental health as we were 10 years ago. And I'm not saying that to sound negative or anything, but it's just a reality of it. We're not moving fast enough, and yet athletes are still experiencing mental health symptoms and disorders. What was the second part of your question?
More around whether or not I think you probably answered it, to be honest, within a contact sport background, whether or not the prevalence of it being shown or depicted through TV or through interviews is beneficial. From my teaching of it, it seems that when I teach students around mental health in sport, they seem to connect more if it's coming from from like a Delhi documentary recently where he speaks about his mental health, or Joe Marler from a rugby background, obviously with his podcast. They seem to connect more if it comes from an athlete's voice rather than a psychologist.
Yeah.
So do we need to empower more current and former athletes to speak around mental health, and that would support it, or again, is that hypothetically something that you would challenge?
I think we can encourage people, whether they do or not is another question. I think we need to humanize mental health, that people experience and is part of the human experience. We're not robots. We don't just feel happy 24/7, and that it's a human function to experience these emotions on a spectrum. Some days you just don't feel up to it. Others you feel like, yeah, okay, I can function really well. And if I was to put that kind of, you dip and then you come back on top and you dip. Sometimes we dip and we stay in that kind of that real low hole for a long time, and the longer we stay down there, the more at risk we are experiencing crisis. So how do we look at bringing people down to not completely to the top of the peak, but certainly out of that kind of hole they're in? And athletes really find themselves in that hole quite a lot. They're away from family, from friends, from things they enjoy doing. We are social beings. We like to be around people. Athletes training could be very isolating, and all these other stuff about sport and the different demands that you get. So I think we have to change the approach also that we speak about mental health. Yes, we know there's stigma to it, but what do we do about it? We know there is stigma. How do we move from that? And I think one thing we need to do as mental health professionals, psychologists, is to contextualize the sport, i.e. we need to move away from this approach of just sit down and talk. So I think at the moment, mental health, if I refer to it as treatments, it's a very westernized way of doing things. It's rooted in Western theoretical kind of frameworks of sit-down therapy. We sit down in a room in somewhat of a confined space, usually in front of a stranger. You tell me all your traumatic things, and you've got an hour to do it. Go. That's, to me, that's not a humane way of getting someone to speak about the different things they've experienced. And it won't work for everyone. Sometimes in a clinical setting, okay, yeah, it might work. You get the information you need to best support someone with the treatments. But more often than not, that's not how things work. And I believe this is also where there's a lot of fault from mental health approaches, where we're not addressing men and the way that men typically behave. Is that they don't want to just sit down and just empty all their emotions. Just no. Bob, invite them around for a kickabout, maybe.
Golf. Me and Russell are a big, and I say this from experience. I've only played golf in the last 5 years, and I certainly won't bore listeners with it again because we mention it enough. But but I've had conversations with my friends in the last 5 years that I would have never had if it wasn't for walking around grass for 4 hours and hitting a ball around the field. And I'm a big advocate for it. And I know that even though they're not from the mindset of psychology or even anything to do with sport, like I said, I've had conversations with them that would never happen if we had that kind of traditionalized sit down and talk. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think there has to be something said for that in a bigger picture.
I think mental health support has to move away again from that just sit down, but how do we again take the support to people, but we contextualize it within their setting? And I think a simple way of kind of doing that is taking the support to their gym, into an environment where they feel comfortable, around people where they might feel comfortable as well, and having those conversations. I remember in boxing, sometimes after a real hard sparring session, we'll sit down and we'll have a chat, and we might be having our protein shake, and we'll be like, oh, that was a really good spar. I spar with some of my really great friends, and afterwards we'll sit down and we'll have a quick chat for 10 minutes. And the amount of times that the person next to me has said, oh, you know what, I've really enjoyed that spar, I feel like I got everything out. And I'm like, well, what do you mean, how you been feeling? And she might turn around and say, well, actually the last couple of days I've really struggled, I've felt really low, but come in here. And that's where it opens up those conversations, not necessarily in a setting where we may be confined in space and you're on a timer. And I'm saying everything has its place, of course. And this conversation goes back to something I really wanted to mention, was around how mental health professionals, with the correct training that they have, need to team up with governing bodies, and then governing bodies being willing to support these initiatives in these spaces so that the athletes have the access, so that we move to these evidence-informed approaches and move away from what I refer to as catfish psychologists, i.e. going to people who don't hold the training, the qualifications, the skill sets to be providing competent support to people who need it. We're seeing, and I said earlier about technology and how it's kind of advancing very quickly, and with that advancement we are seeing people using things like social media to create a persona of being a mental skills coach, a resilience coach. They've paid X amount of money, I've got X amount of followers and engagement. So credibility now looks a little bit different to maybe what it looked like 10 years ago. And people who are in vulnerable places and who desperately need help will start to look for answers sometimes. And so if you go on social media and you see someone who offers you this amazing support that can change your life within 8 sessions, as long as you pay them £1,000, they will change your life in 8 sessions. And the secret to it was, you just got to wake up early and have a cold shower and have avocado on toast. Well, obviously I'm simplifying it. Yeah, or you can have mud.
Yeah.
Have a mud bath.
So what should people be kind of looking out for? What would your recommendations be?
I think just generally, if someone is feeling like, I always go back to crisis. I've started working in applied crisis work very recently in the summer. So I think athlete or not, if you're experiencing crisis, there are some incredible support services out there. Soul and Mind, given that we're in Southampton, Soul and Mind offers some amazing community support from the kind of community wellbeing services. That's absolutely free and open to anyone and everyone. They have young people's groups, they have men's groups, they have women's groups. Is to reach out to those services. If you feel like you're in crisis, is to go to Soul and Mind's out of hours crisis team. They're called the Lighthouse. And that's one of the teams I've recently started working with in the summer, and learned a lot from the team. They're incredible people. Athlete or not, they are there to support you. If you're an athlete, I think it's reaching out to the very people that you trust. But this is where the but comes in. Are you going to get the support that you need? I can't confidently say yes, you will.
So if they reach out to someone that they trust, maybe a coach or a friend, and that friend doesn't necessarily feel confident or comfortable speaking about that, or they might not have spoken about these sorts of topics before, is there any advice you could give that friend or that coach that they kind of should say, they definitely should avoid? I know you mentioned like a phrase like man up.
Yeah.
Is there anything that they definitely shouldn't do? Is there anything, if a coach is listening to this, what would you advise them?
I think one of the things that I would suggest is being very mindful of the language you use, and with that is not using derogatory terms and like dismissive language, like you'll just get over it, just sleep on it and you might wake up feeling better. Like that's very dismissing. You're dismissing someone's feeling. So I think not dismissing someone, but letting them know that you hear them. I think that's for someone who may be in crisis, and some people may listen to this may have lived experience. The last thing you want to hear is, just get over it, just smile more. Like it's again dismissive language, but rather feeling heard. So I hear you. I'm really sorry if you're going through that. And that's that kind of human touch to it. Is that okay? I feel heard. I feel like someone cares. Those words alone could make someone feel a little bit better. I'm not saying it's going to cure them, or not that you can forever cure mental health symptoms or disorders, but it can help someone kind of ease the pain of what they're experiencing. And asking questions like, how would you feel if you were to speak to your GP? How would you feel if we went together and spoke to a coach? Humanizing their feelings, making them feel like they're not alone. Those are some of the first things I think I would go to, and I would advise someone. Just don't dismiss their feelings. I think that's one of the worst things anyone can do.
I think Tom and I did, and a few other colleagues did the mental health first aid training course over the summer, and I think that was kind of, they echoed those sorts of statements that you were saying. But one thing that kind of stood out to me, it was, if you don't know what to say I honestly don't know what to say. I don't know. I don't have the words for this, rather than sort of being dismissive or anything like that. I thought that kind of stuck with me. If you really just don't know what to say, just just try and be honest and open and be a bit more human. Yeah,
exactly. I think it's a lot of these approaches misses the human part of it. Like, at the end of the day, we are all human. Yes, we may be this or that athlete or a boxer, but we will forever be a human, and humans have emotions, and so we have to address those emotions.
I think moving forward then, as we come towards the end, I think it's a good opportunity to give you the floor, Shakiba, if there was anything that you wanted to either use today's platform to discuss, or if there was anything that you had. I can see looking over that you've got a phone full of notes, but is there anything on here that that you feel like you wanted to shed a little bit more light on, or discuss in a little bit more detail? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to say was around research. I spoke a lot about like how research needs to develop. I kind of ripped into it actually quite a lot now I think about it. But
save yourself, quick. Save yourself.
Doing good job, guys. So I think one thing I would say from research in mental health generally, but particularly in sport, is we have to really move away from self-report measures, because it doesn't give us a clear picture. So what a lot of research is saying at the moment, and I think some of my notes I've taken was from Vincent Gottenbarge's work, who was actually a football player himself at quite elite level. So it's interesting that he has that background and then kind of went into this work, is that a lot of the work in this area is from a self-report perspective. And when I did my systematic review, one of the things that kind of skewed the findings was that the abundance of different measures that were being used. So then how do you coherently take those prevalence rates and make concrete statements if everyone's using different measures? So I use this as an example with depression. So if you're looking at depression, you're looking at depressive symptoms. There's loads of different forms of depression you can get. So what measure are we using, for example, to measure depressive symptoms? Now, some measures, for some reason, look at anxiety and depression. They couple the two together. Now, anxiety and depression are very separate mental health disorders. Anxiety has an abundance of different types of anxieties, like phobia and so on, like panic disorder. Depression has its different forms of depression. You can have chronic and so on. Again, so while we're bunching the two together, to me, it takes away from the impact that it has on someone and people's experiences with those two different disorders. So as researchers in the area, we need to call that out and then address it, because what a lot of the research is kind of suggesting is that, yes, athletes are experiencing mental health symptoms and disorders, some athletes more than others. So, for example, in rugby players had one of the highest prevalence rates of alcohol misuse and alcohol use. So much so that I actually crossed over to the diagnostic criteria for people who experience alcohol misuse entirely and become alcoholics as well, and as a result of that, and so would need treatment for that. And what we found this pattern was that this was only happening during the off season when they're not training. When as soon as they're on season, that completely changed. But then we still need to address that part of it because it's important, and not just completely forget about it because just the off season. Well, then do we need to address that because prevalence rates are really high? And how is that then being measured across other athletes as well? Are we using the same measures and tools and diagnostic criteria? And sometimes I feel like we shy away from some of that clinical approach in sports psychology, where I think if we can take snippets of it and use it where it would be really helpful, like looking at prevalence rates in sport, we can have more concrete, definitive findings, where then our approach to helping the athletes will be much more better informed. So I think research really needs to move away from self-report measures and become more consistent and coherent in the way that we measure mental health symptoms and disorders. And then secondly, I think I wanted to touch on Dr. Paul Grzycki's work. I spoke earlier about Paul's work, but I think his work is now moving towards looking at the explicit kind of demographic differences of athletes, looking at, for example, athletes who may have different disabilities. How do they experience mental health symptoms and disorders? What does treatment look for them? athletes of color, what does treatment look for them? Athletes from different sexual orientations, transgender athletes, what are their experiences, for example? So I think we need to stop overgeneralizing athletes, but actually look at the demographics of athletes and how do we support them with tailored approaches that are evidence informed, that also move away from some of those self-report measures too.
And for you, what next? Which one of those are you going to tackle?
Goodness.
Or is it another PhD? What does the next 5 years look like for you?
You know what? I've taken a really keen interest in looking at areas where there's like high performance and elite athletes, but they have complete lack of like sports psychology. So in the summer, I worked with a group of athletes out in Aruba, and Aruba is this tiny island in the Caribbean. And it was one of the most fascinating like work I've done with the Caribbean athletes, and it was because there is a lack of resources and funding. And again, a lot of research has been done on this at the moment. I was reading up on with, for example, Caribbean athletes on the sports psychology, on mental health, and so on. So I really enjoyed addressing that part where there's scarcity entirely on sports psychology, and like it's a new evolving area. And I mean, sports psychology, you know, here is quite new anyway. I mean, you'd be lucky for all of clubs to have a sports psychologist and or speak about it. But to take us somewhere where it's speak about infancy, but it's kind of pre-existing infancy even. So I really enjoyed kind of delivering the workshop and speaking about it and how we can help and change perspectives and performance in sport. So I really want to continue that work, and it's a privilege to work with Arubian athletes and with the kind of Aruba sport federations. I really want to continue that. So that's where I see kind of myself within the sport area. Sports psychology is taking that to areas where I'm privileged enough to be able to support people where they would work with me, of course, as well. That's where I see it. And I think research-wise, I'm completely sticking within this mental health literacy area. I think looking at diversifying mental health literacy interventions, contextualizing it in the way I said, but also paying attention to those demographic differences too.
Amazing. I think that is really good for time as well. So what I'm going to do is start to look towards how we started this episode today as we come to a close. And obviously you had the question from Caitlin. Good luck trying to follow one of this depth and detail as well. But can you provide us with one question for our next guest? We won't tell you who the next guest is, around well-being. It can be general well-being, it can be sport well-being, but one question for the next guest. Okay,
I'm really glad you said the last bit about well-being, because I had two questions.
Were you going to ask if they have mud kebabs?
No, but it was going to be, what animal would you be and why? But I'm not asking that. So I think my question would be for them, what does mental health mean to you?
Okay.
And to get them to describe it from a non-academic, non-textbook area, but what does mental health mean to them?
Amazing. Because I know who our next guest is, and I think they will really enjoy that question. So no spoilers, but thank you very, very much for the question. Thank you very, very much for the podcast. We've survived, Russ, as hosts.
Yeah, I know. Welcome Kev back soon.
I'm sure he will be back for the next episode. But again, I'm sure all of the listeners will really engage with each of the different elements that you've shared, even for ourselves from a psychology background. I found it fascinating to hear from an expert in the area. Again, thank you very much for giving up your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
It's a pleasure.